Kess Harwin stood in the clearing, hands empty, watching the instructor's shuttle climb toward orbit, with the kind of detached interest normally reserved for watching paint dry in reduced gravity. The engine wash had flattened the moss in a perfect circle around the landing site, and already the native vegetation was beginning to straighten, resilient in that aggressively casual way that suggested this moon had seen worse than shuttle exhaust. The briefing still rattled around in her head, with all the charm of a recorded safety announcement. 14 planetary rotations, no equipment, demonstrate self-sufficiency, prove your species has what it takes to thrive in adverse conditions. Standard survival course rhetoric, delivered by instructors who clearly believed they'd designed something character-building and educational rather than what it actually was. An elaborate exercise in watching people panic. Her classmates had dispersed within minutes of touchdown, each racing toward the resource zones they'd identified during the orbital approach. Vect, the Vrelt whose carapace plating made him look like a military vehicle that had achieved sentience, had thundered off toward the rocky northern zone, where thermal scans suggested cave systems and protein-rich insect colonies. Luminara, yes, that was actually the Corim's name, because apparently her species believed in truth in advertising, had headed for the western meadows where her photosynthetic capabilities would combine beautifully with open sunlight. Theris, the Tars, whose thermal regulation system was supposed to make environmental adaptation trivial, had chosen the forested eastern zone with its dense canopy and assumed shelter opportunities. Kess had stayed in the clearing, doing absolutely nothing, which had probably confused the monitoring satellites, but seemed like the obviously correct first move to her. Because here was the thing the instructors had overlooked in their careful test design: humans didn't survive by rushing toward the biggest pile of resources and hoping for the best. They survived by watching first, thinking second, and acting third in that order, with irritating patience that drove every predator species absolutely insane. The clearing wasn't empty, it was full of information, and information was a resource that didn't run away if you didn't grab it immediately. She began cataloging, establishing a mental grid that divided the clearing into manageable quadrants. Northeast section, purple-barked saplings growing in suspiciously regular clusters, suggesting either intelligent planting or some very organized natural seeding pattern. Southeast, the fallen log she'd noticed immediately, its surface covered in scoring marks that could be animal claws, could be weather damage, could be something else entirely. Southwest, dense moss coverage that held morning moisture longer than the other quadrants, indicating drainage patterns and soil composition. Northwest, mature trees heavy with those vines, the ones that covered every trunk like botanical scaffolding that had decided to unionize. The vines interested her most. They were everywhere, which meant something. Nature didn't create universal abundance without purpose. Either these vines were invasively aggressive, or they served some fundamental utility in this ecosystem that made their proliferation a feature rather than a bug. Kess approached the nearest tree, running her fingers along a vine that hung at convenient human height, testing its structure without pulling. Fibrous outer layer, slightly rough, covered in tiny hairs that probably aided climbing. Beneath that, she could feel a woody core that gave the vine structural integrity. And at regular intervals, she counted them, finding the pattern, joints that seemed to weaken the overall structure intentionally, as if the plant wanted to shed sections periodically. Interesting. She walked the perimeter slowly, ignoring the small voice in her head that sounded suspiciously like the lead instructor suggesting she should be finding food and shelter right now, immediately, with appropriate desperation. That voice didn't understand that observing was doing something. She noted which plants grew in shade versus direct sunlight, which showed evidence of being browsed by local fauna, which seemed to avoid growing near other species. The purple barks, for instance, created acidic soil that nothing else tolerated within a meter of their trunks. The vines didn't care, they climbed the purple barks anyway, suggesting either immunity or stupidity, and plants weren't generally stupid. A distant bellow echoed from the northern rocky zone. That would be Vect, discovering that natural armor plating didn't help much when you were hungry, and everything edible was either too fast or too well defended, or hiding in crevices too small for a Vreld to access. Kess filed the sound away under predictable problems I don't have, and kept cataloging. Where vines had fallen naturally, and there were several on the ground, suggesting regular shedding, she could observe how they weathered. Some had separated into individual fibers, each about as thick as her smallest finger, that remained strong and pliable, even after obvious exposure to elements. Others had dried intact, their woody cores exposed, rigid as manufactured poles. A few showed intermediate states, partially separated, the fibers loosening but not fully detached. Kess knelt beside one of these partially separated vines, working her fingers into the gap between fiber and core, pulling gently. The fibers came away cleanly, lengths of natural cordage that might as well have been labeled "free rope, please take some." She pulled several meters free, testing the breaking strength carefully, learning how much force the material could handle before it started to fail. Not bad. Not sophisticated by any industrial standard, but significantly better than having nothing, which was currently what she had. The fallen log became her workbench mostly because it was there and approximately the right height. Kess began harvesting vines methodically, developing selection criteria as she worked. Fresh green ones for maximum flexibility, dried ones for structural rigidity, ones with the woody cores already exposed for applications requiring hardness. She wasn't making anything yet, wasn't rushing toward construction, just preparing materials and laying them out in sorted bundles organized by properties and potential uses. The instructors had designed this test around deprivation, removed the tools, removed the safety nets, removed the convenient shortcuts, and watch the candidates scramble to meet basic needs with appropriate struggle. It was a reasonable test design if you assumed people were helpless without their specific technological advantages. But humans had this peculiar evolutionary trait that the instructors had apparently never quite internalized. Humans made tools to make tools to make tools, in recursive chains of capability that started with absolutely nothing and ended with orbital stations, given enough time and motivation. Kess didn't need a blade, she needed an edge, and edges could be manufactured from rocks if you were patient and willing to accept functional rather than perfect. The stream that fed the clearing's southeast section provided flat stones worn smooth by water action. She selected one approximately the size of her palm, testing its feel, then found a harder stone with a pointed edge suitable for grinding. 20 minutes of patient work, adjusting her angle, learning how the stones interacted, understanding which force vector created useful material removal versus which just made noise. The result wouldn't impress anyone who'd seen actual metallurgy, but it had an edge, and that edge could split vine fibers more efficiently than her fingers alone. She tested it, adjusting her technique, learning the material. The fresh vines separated easily once you understood the grain structure. The dried ones required more force but split along predictable lines. The partially dried ones were actually most useful. They combined flexibility with enough rigidity to hold shapes, perfect for applications requiring both properties. By the time the moon's primary sun reached zenith, casting sharp shadows that indicated this planet's axial tilt was fairly minimal, Kess had cordage. Not sophisticated, somewhat uneven in thickness, with a few weak points she'd need to remember, but undeniably rope. Coils of it, organized by length and quality, ready for applications she hadn't fully defined yet. From the western meadows, Luminara's humming carried on the wind. The corms sang while they photosynthesized, apparently finding the process meditative. The humming had started confident and melodic. Now it carried a strained quality that suggested Luminara was discovering that photosynthesis worked brilliantly for energy needs until you needed shelter from the approaching night and realized you'd spent all day standing in sunlight instead of building anything. Kess allowed herself a small smile and began thinking about shelter, not building it. Thinking about it, because there was a difference between reacting to immediate need and planning something that would actually work, and that difference usually determined whether you spent 14 days surviving or 14 days living. She observed the sun's trajectory, using her shadow as a sundial, noting where light fell during different hours. The clearing's microclimate became apparent with patience. Morning condensation appeared heaviest on vegetation in the southwest quadrant, suggesting that's where cold air pooled overnight. The prevailing wind came from the northwest, carrying the scent of the forest beyond. The northeast quadrant stayed consistently dry, had natural windbreak from those purple bark saplings, and offered slight elevation, maybe a meter higher than the lowest point, that would prevent water accumulation during rain. Kess wasn't making a survival shelter, she was making a camp. The distinction mattered. Survival shelters were desperate, minimal, temporary structures built by people focused entirely on not dying in the next few hours. Camps were intentional. Camps implied you planned to be somewhere long enough that comfort and organization mattered. The instructors probably expected survival shelters. They'd probably calibrated their assessment rubrics around candidates who built desperate lean toes and huddled miserably while congratulating themselves for not freezing. That seemed inefficient. She began with foundation, because starting with walls was how you ended up with structures that sagged, shifted, and failed when you actually needed them. A rectangle of logs, each selected for straightness within reasonable tolerances, each cut to length using her stone edge and patient sawing that would have gone faster with actual tools but still worked fine. The notching took longer. Cutting joints that would lock the logs together required understanding wood grain and accepting that the first few attempts would be learning experiences rather than successes. By the fourth log, she'd figured out the technique. The notches didn't need to be perfect. They needed to be functional. She fit them together, lashed them with her vine cordage, tested the structure by standing on it. It held. Good enough. The framework rose slowly, not from urgency, but from methodical planning. Each piece served multiple purposes, because single-purpose construction was wasteful. Structural members that supported the roof also created storage spaces underneath. Support posts also formed the framework for a smoke vent she'd need for the fire she hadn't built yet, but would. Corner braces also served as tool racks. Everything connected to everything else in ways that made the whole structure more robust than any individual component. By evening, she had a frame. Just the skeleton, no walls or roof yet, but the bones of something solid. The structure sat in the northeast quadrant, positioned to catch morning sun but avoid afternoon heat, protected from prevailing winds but open enough for air circulation, elevated enough that water would flow around rather than through. From the eastern forest zone, Theris's clicking had developed a distressed quality. The TAS's thermal regulation apparently didn't extend to comfort because the moon's temperature swings, mild by most standards, but still a 20-degree variance between day and night, seemed to be more extreme than their biology appreciated. Kess could hear the clicking speed up as the temperature dropped, a stress response that suggested Theris was burning energy to maintain homeostasis rather than actually staying comfortable. She banked her non-existent fire, which was to say, she organized the fire pit location and gathered tinder and settled in for the night under her roofless frame, wrapped in a bundle of dried moss that provided surprising insulation. Not comfortable, exactly, but adequate. Tomorrow would bring walls and roofing. Tonight was for rest and listening to the clearing's nighttime sounds, learning what moved after dark, understanding the ecosystem's rhythms. Day 2 began with assessment. Kess checked her cordage for stress points, found 2 joints where the vine fibers had compressed more than expected, reinforced them with additional lashing. She walked around her shelter frame from different angles, considering it the way an artist might study an unfinished sculpture, looking for problems before they became failures. She needed covering, insulation, waterproofing. The large leaves from the purple bark saplings caught her attention during her morning perimeter walk. They were substantial, roughly the size of her torso, with a waxy coating that had shed the brief morning rain. Barely a drizzle, really, but enough to demonstrate water-shedding properties. The leaves overlapped naturally when layered properly, their weight and texture creating a shingled effect that would channel water downward rather than allowing penetration. Harvesting required care. The purple barks didn't appreciate having their leaves removed. They oozed a sap that probably discouraged herbivores and definitely discouraged casual handling. Kess used her stone blade to cut the stem rather than pulling, which seemed to minimize sap production and kept the trees from getting too agitated about the whole process. She took only what she needed from each tree, leaving enough foliage for the plant's health, because killing your resource base was how you ended up desperate later. The layering took hours. Each leaf placed deliberately, secured with vine cordage at the stem, overlapped to create runoff channels that would direct water away from the shelter's interior. She started at the bottom edge and worked upward, letting each row overlap the one below, testing the pattern by pouring water from her cupped hands and watching where it flowed. Adjustments happened in real time, learning from observation, improving the design as she worked. The shelter wasn't beautiful. It looked like exactly what it was, functional construction by someone working with limited materials and no formal training. But it was thought through. Every element served a purpose, every purpose connected to a larger plan, and the whole thing would keep her dry, protected and moderately comfortable for as long as she needed to stay here. She established a routine, because routines were how humans converted chaos into manageable existence. Mornings for gathering and processing materials, more cordage, more leaves for repairs, wood for eventual fire. Midday for construction and improvement, when her energy was highest and the light was best for detailed work. Afternoons for exploration and expanding her understanding of the ecosystem, learning which plants were edible through careful testing protocols that involved tiny portions and waiting periods, mapping the clearing's resources, observing animal behavior patterns. The instructors monitored from orbit, no doubt expecting degradation, desperation, or defeat. Standard survival course metrics, calibrated around candidates who struggled appropriately. Kess wondered if they were watching her measure out a dedicated storage area with vine cordage marking boundaries, or documenting her careful food testing protocol where she touched potential edibles to her lips, waited an hour, then tried a tiny amount, waited 4 hours, then tried a slightly larger amount, waiting between each step, with the patience of someone who understood that dying from poisoning would be embarrassing and entirely avoidable. Probably not. They were likely watching Vec try to punch through a log to reach insect colonies, which was entertaining but not particularly educational. Fire required patience humans had developed over several 100,000 years of watching lightning strikes and thinking we should make that happen on purpose. Kess created a bow drill from dried vine wood. The woody cores worked perfectly. Cordage she'd specifically prepared for tension applications, and careful observation of which materials generated the most friction when pressed together and rotated rapidly. The first attempts failed. The second session produced smoke, which was progress but not success. The third session, after adjustments to her technique and a better understanding of pressure distribution, created an ember that she nursed into actual flame with dried moss and steady breath that provided oxygen without blowing the ember apart. The instructors had probably expected candidates to freeze or eat everything raw, demonstrating grit through miserable perseverance. Kess arranged stones into a proper fire pit, with draft channels that would feed air to the combustion zone, created a raised platform for fuel storage that would keep wood dry and ready, and established a cooking area at safe distance from her shelter, because burning down your home was also embarrassing and avoidable. She wasn't camping, she was homesteading. The difference mattered to her, even if it didn't matter to the assessment rubrics. With fire established, she expanded operations. A drying rack constructed from straight branches and vine cordage, positioned near the fire but not close enough to ignite, where she could preserve food for later consumption rather than relying on constant fresh foraging. A separate workspace for tool creation, because mixing food preparation and tool manufacturing was how you got stone chips in your dinner. A water collection system using large purple bark leaves positioned to funnel morning condensation into vine-woven baskets that didn't need to be perfectly watertight, just functional enough to hold liquid long enough to transfer it elsewhere. Each addition served multiple purposes, each purpose connected to the next phase of her plan. The drying rack also served as a windbreak. The tool workspace doubled as a teaching area where she could sit and practice techniques until they became automatic. The water collection system also demonstrated local weather patterns and helped her understand the clearing's hydrology. The Corim appeared at the clearing's edge on day 4, looking exhausted despite biological advantages that should have made this test trivial. Luminara's usual bioluminescence had dimmed to a faint glow that suggested energy depletion, and her movements carried the careful deliberation of someone operating on reserves. She stood at the tree line, clearly hoping to observe Kess's techniques, probably expecting either hostility or charity. Kess offered neither. She continued her work, currently weaving a more sophisticated basket, using techniques she'd figured out through trial and error, and didn't hide her methods. The materials were right there, available to anyone. The techniques were visible. If Luminara wanted to learn by watching, fine. If she wanted to ask questions, also fine. But Kess wasn't going to stop her routine to provide tutorial services for someone who'd made different strategic choices and was now dealing with predictable consequences. Luminara watched for an hour, then retreated to the western meadows without speaking. Kess continued weaving. Orbital monitoring showed concerning data, at least from the instructor's perspective. The human's biometrics indicated minimal stress, elevated slightly from baseline but nothing suggesting distress. Adequate caloric intake, demonstrated by stable energy levels and maintained body mass. Regular sleep patterns in established circadian rhythm. The stress hormones they'd expected to see spiking were absent. Concerning, the other candidates displayed expected degradation curves. Vecht had injured himself twice, once attempting to break into a particularly stubborn log, and once misjudging a climb in the rocky terrain. The Vrelt's natural healing was handling it, but the injuries had cost time and energy. Theris was technically surviving, but clearly miserable. The Tess's clicking now continuous and frantic as their thermal regulation system struggled with environmental adaptation. Luminara's backup nutritional systems were compensating for her inability to construct adequate shelter, converting stored reserves to maintain function, but those reserves wouldn't last the full 14 days. The human appeared to be thriving, not surviving, thriving. The lead instructor reviewed footage of Kess's camp with growing concern that this wasn't demonstrating what the test was designed to measure. Organized workspace with tools arranged by function and frequency of use. Functional shelter with weatherproofing that had survived 2 rainstorms without apparent leakage. Maintained fire with prepared fuel stocks and backup tinder stored in a dry location. Food storage area with preserved rations and ongoing foraging that suggested understanding of nutritional needs. Even what appeared to be a recreational area where the humans sat in the evenings processing materials while watching the sunset, like someone on vacation rather than someone being evaluated. "She's made a home," the assistant instructor observed, somewhat awed. The lead instructor frowned at the feeds. This wasn't the test's intention. The test intended to measure desperation management, resource competition under scarcity, baseline survival instinct when stripped of technological advantages. Kess was demonstrating colony establishment protocols. She wasn't fighting the environment, she was integrating with it, adapting to it, organizing it around her needs, without apparent stress or urgency. On screen, the human reinforced her shelter's corners with additional lashing, her movements methodical and unhurried, absolutely unconcerned that she was being evaluated. She worked the way someone might garden on a weekend, focused but relaxed, competent but not showing off, simply doing what needed doing because it needed doing. "She hasn't even tried to contact the other candidates," the assistant instructor noted. "No cooperation attempts, no conflict, no interaction at all. She doesn't need them," the lead instructor said slowly, understanding dawning with uncomfortable clarity. "She doesn't need us to end the test early. She could stay there indefinitely." On day 14, the retrieval shuttle descended with the thunderous drama landing craft always employed, whether necessary or not. Kess had spent the morning organizing her camp, more from habit than necessity. Everything had a place. Every place had a purpose. The camp functioned like a small machine, each component supporting the others, the whole thing operating smoothly enough that she'd spent the last few days mostly improving refinements rather than addressing needs. The other candidates emerged from various states of disheveled survival. Vect limped from the northern zone, his carapace cracked in 2 places, his movements stiff with injury and exhaustion. Luminara drifted from the western meadows, her bioluminescence barely visible in daylight, moving with the slow determination of someone operating on emergency reserves. Theris emerged from the eastern forest, wrapped in inadequate leaf covering, shivering despite moderate temperatures, their thermal regulation system apparently having given up entirely on comfort in favor of basic survival. Kess walked from her camp, carrying a neatly bundled collection of her tools, coils of cordage organized by quality, her stone blade wrapped in leaves for safety. A few other implements she'd created for specific purposes, like someone leaving a vacation rental and taking the complimentary toiletries. She'd left the camp itself intact, the shelter sound, the fire banked but ready to rekindle, the workspace organized, everything ready for the next occupant if one ever arrived. The instructors stood by the shuttle, data tablets in hand, clearly unsure how to proceed with scoring. Every measured parameter showed the human had exceeded requirements by substantial margins. Adequate shelter, adequate nutrition, adequate resource management, adequate adaptation to environmental conditions, but she'd done it wrong. She was supposed to struggle, to demonstrate grit through adversity, to barely survive with appropriate drama and character growth through hardship. Instead, she'd turned an uninhabited moon into a weekend retreat and looked vaguely disappointed the test was ending. "Why did you stay in the clearing?" the lead instructor finally asked, genuine confusion in their voice. The resource-rich zones were identified in the briefing. "You had the same information as the other candidates." Kess considered the question, then glanced back at the camp she was leaving behind. The shelter stood solid, its purple bark leaf roof already weathering into the landscape, vines beginning to creep up the support posts like the moon was reclaiming its materials. The fire pit stones were arranged in permanent configuration. The workspace showed signs of use, but no degradation. Someone could walk into that camp right now and have everything they needed to survive comfortably, ready and waiting. "The clearing had vines," she said simply, as if this explained everything. To her, it did. The instructor waited for elaboration that didn't come. They'd write in their assessment that humans possessed unusual material adaptability and displayed tendencies toward over-preparation that bordered on compulsive organization. They'd note that the human candidate had met all requirements with minimal stress response and recommend the species for survival-heavy roles. They'd completely miss the actual point. Humans didn't see survival as a test to endure, but as a problem to solve, and solving it properly meant building something that lasted longer than strictly necessary, just because they could. It meant creating systems instead of scrambling for resources. It meant thinking 3 steps ahead while everyone else panicked about the current moment. It meant looking at a clearing full of vines and seeing not limitations but possibilities, then methodically converting those possibilities into reality through patient observation and incremental improvement. The shuttle rose, its engines scattering the carefully organized moss around Kess's former landing site. She watched the camp shrink below, already weathering back into the landscape, and experienced the distinct satisfaction of having left a place better than she found it, even if no one else would ever use it. The instructors had taken every tool, expecting desperation. They'd removed the safety nets, expecting struggle. They'd stripped away the technological advantages, expecting candidates to demonstrate survival instinct through barely managed panic. They'd forgotten that humans didn't just use tools, they were the tool-making species, and given nothing but vines and patience, they'd build a civilization just to prove the point.